Charles IV of France died in 1328, leaving behind his young daughter and pregnant wife, Joan of Evreux. He had decreed that, if the unborn child were male, he was to become King of France. If not, Charles left the choice of his successor to the nobles. Unfortunately, Joan gave birth to a girl, Blanche of France. With the birth of a girl, the main male line of the House of Capet was rendered extinct. By proximity of blood, the nearest male relative of Charles IV was his nephew, Edward III of England. However, the French nobility was not buying the idea of being ruled by an Englishman. To avoid this, they decided that males who derive their right to inheritance through their mother should be excluded from consideration. Therefore, excluding Edward III, they now had to find another option. The other nearest heir through the male line was Charles IV's first cousin, Philip, Count of Valois. It was decided that he should take the throne. He was crowned as Philip VI in 1328 as the new King of France. In England, Edward III had made it to the English crown in the previous year of 1327. Edward III was now a vassal of Philip VI of France because of his territorial possessions in France. With this, he was required to recognize the suzerainty of the King of France over these territories, or simply, he should respect the decisions of Philip of France because these territories were inside France. English argued that, as Charles IV, the previous King of France, had not acted properly towards his tenant, Edward should be able to hold the Duchy of Guyenne free of French suzerainty. The French rejected this argument, so in 1329, the 17-year-old Edward III of England reluctantly recognized France's Philip VI and paid him homage for the Duchy of Aquitaine and Gascony. After that, he expected to be left undisturbed while he made war on Scotland back at home. But instead, the French continued to pressure the English administration in these territories. To resolve this, a delegation from England invited Philip of France in April 1337 to meet them, but he refused. Philip was not buying the idea of having English possessions in his territory. He went on in May 1337 and met with his Great Council in Paris. The French council agreed that the Duchy of Gascony should be taken back into the king's hands because Edward III was in breach of his obligations as a vassal and had sheltered the king's mortal enemy, Robert d'Artagnan. This resolution left Edward III of England furious. He responded by challenging Philip's right to the French throne. However, his claim was considered invalidated by his homage to Philip VI in 1329. This meant that Edward of England had to give up his claims for the French throne. In 1340, he revived his claim, formally assuming the title King of France and receiving homage from representatives of Flanders. Flanders had now proclaimed Edward of England as the legitimate King of France. But this was not enough for Edward because he wanted the entire France to proclaim his legitimacy. In February 1340, he returned to England to try to raise more funds and also deal with political difficulties. To Philip of France, this was a provocation. He identified that Flanders was tied to the English due to the wool from England because Flanders' principal cities relied heavily on textile production and England supplied much of the raw material they needed. To tackle this, he used French superiority at sea to disrupt this trade, hence shrinking the wool trade to Flanders and the wine trade from Gascony. On June 22, 1340, Edward and his fleet sailed from England and arrived off the Zwin estuary the next day. The French fleet assumed a defensive formation off the port of Sluis. However, the English deceived the French into believing they were withdrawing. In the late afternoon, the winds shifted direction towards France. The English turned with it, attacking with the sun behind them. The French fleet was almost destroyed in what became known as the Battle of Sluis. After the victory at Sluis, the English dominated the channel for the rest of the war, preventing French invasions on their homeland. However, it was costly to keep containing the French hit-and runs. And after 1 year of fighting, Edward's funds ran out, and the war probably would have ended were it not for the death of the Duke of Brittany in 1341. When the Duke of Brittany died, it precipitated a succession dispute between the Duke's half-brother, John of Montfort, and Charles of Blois, nephew of Philip VI. Edward backed John of Montfort, and Philip backed Charles of Blois. The English backed Montfort finally took the Duchy of Brittany.